Hello and welcome to ProfDale's property video number 16. The topic of this video is an introduction to concurrent ownership. This is the first of 5 videos on concurrent ownership, and here's a slide that lists all 5 of them. Number 16 is the one you're watching now. Number 17 is about severance of joint tenancies. Number 18 about relations among cotenants. 19 and 20 are about 2 specialized forms of concurrent ownership. 19 is about tenancy by the entirety, and 20 is about community property and homestead rights. So what do we mean by concurrent ownership? Well, what we mean is that 2 or more people can have a simultaneous right of possession of the same property. It almost seems impossible. You might say, well, 2 people can't really occupy the same space at the same time, but legally in concurrent ownership, they are entitled to do exactly that. I want you to distinguish concurrent ownership from present and future interests, which we covered in our earlier videos. Future interests involve sequential possession. That is, where one person will have possession for a period of time, such as a life estate, followed by another person having possession for an additional period of time, such as a remainder or a reversion. So those are sequential interests, but in concurrent ownership, our present topic, we're talking about simultaneous rights of possession of multiple parties to the same real estate. Now, there are 4 kinds of concurrent ownership that we're going to consider. The first kind is tenancy in common, and the second is joint tenancy with right of survivorship. These are the 2 most common. They're universally recognized in essentially every state in the country, and we're going to spend most of our time talking about them. However, there are 2 other more specialized kinds of concurrent ownership. Both of them are permissible only between a married couple. The first one is tenancy by the entirety. It can exist only between married couples and is recognized in about half the states. It's somewhat similar to joint tenancy with right of survivorship, but we have a special video just devoted to tenancy by the entirety, so we won't talk about it any further in this video. The final one is community property. Again, it's only between married persons. It's recognized in 9 states, and it is somewhat similar to tenancy in common. But again, we have a special video devoted to it, so we won't cover it any further here. Now, we often call a concurrent ownership relationship a cotenancy. And in this slide, we're going to consider how cotenancies are created. Ordinarily, any interest in land can be created by deed or by will, and many times interests in land are also created by intestate succession. That is, when someone dies without a will and the property passes to their heirs. Now, all 3 of those methods work for a tenancy in common. It can be created by a deed, by a will, or by intestate succession. But a joint tenancy with right of survivorship is different. It can be created by a deed or a will, but it cannot be created by intestate succession. The reason is simple. Intestate succession is governed by a statute in each state, and none of those statutes provide that when property passes to heirs, it passes as joint tenancy with right of survivorship. The property in intestate succession always passes by tenancy in common instead. The obvious difference between a tenancy in common and a joint tenancy with right of survivorship is the right of survivorship. Joint tenancies have it. In fact, there's no such thing as a joint tenancy without a right of survivorship. Tenancies in common don't have a right of survivorship. In this slide, we're going to look at the way the right of survivorship works. We're going to assume the property is owned 1/3 by A, 1/3 by B, and 1/3 by C, and the 3 of them are joint tenants with right of survivorship. So each of them owns the property and has the right to possess it. Then let's assume that A dies. What happens to B's and C's shares? Well, they get bigger, so that now B has, instead of a 1/3 interest, a 1/2 interest. Likewise, C now has a 1/2 interest. You'll notice that nothing passes from A to A's heirs or A's devisees if A leaves a will. The interest that was owned by A simply disappears. It's terminated, and B's and C's interests get larger at the same time. Later on, let's assume that B dies. What happens now again is that B's interest terminates, once again because B isn't the last of the group to die, and C's interest goes from 1/2 or 50% to a 100% interest. Now when C dies, C can pass that entire 100% interest to C's heirs or C's devisees if C leaves a will. So what's the effect of a will, or for that matter intestate succession, left by A or by B? They're not the last of the group to die, so the result is that their will or intestate succession will have no effect at all. Only the will or the intestate succession of the last of the group to die has any effect in disposing of the property. Now let's assume exactly the same facts, except that this time A, B, and C will be tenants in common, each of them with a 1/3 interest in the property. As long as all three of them are alive, of course, they get to possess the property equally. Let's now assume that A dies, and when A dies, A's 1/3 will pass directly to A's heirs or devisees. That has no effect on B's and C's interests. They continue to hold their 1/3 shares each. Later on, if B dies, B's interest passes to B's heirs or devisees, and likewise, if C dies, C's interest passes to C's heirs or devisees. So the order of death among A, B, and C doesn't matter in a tenancy in common, and each of them can dispose of their property, their 1/3 share, essentially the same way as if they owned an entire separate piece of real estate. Now we've seen that a deed or a will can create either a tenancy in common or a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. So which one is going to be created by a given deed or will? That, of course, depends on the wording of that instrument. So let's take a look at some possible wording. One possibility is that O, the owner of land, will simply deed, quote, to A and B, and not specify which type of cotenancy O has in mind. The result is that A and B have a tenancy in common. The reason is we presume a tenancy in common if there isn't any definite statement in the conveyance about which form of cotenancy the grantor intended to create. That would be true whether it was a deed or a will. Now suppose the grantor is a little more specific and says, I deed this property to A and B as joint tenants. You'll notice that the grantor didn't say with right of survivorship. He just said as joint tenants. So the question is whether that is sufficient to create a joint tenancy. It might or might not, depending on the state. The case law is divided on that. In some states, the result would be that because the grantor didn't say with right of survivorship, A and B would end up with only a tenancy in common instead. Other states would say, well, the intent to make it a joint tenancy with right of survivorship is sufficiently clear and will give A and B a joint tenancy with right of survivorship, even though there are no words of survivorship. Finally, suppose the grantor deeds to A and B as joint tenants with right of survivorship. In every state, that will be sufficient to actually give them a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. The intent there is so clearly spelled out that it's not arguable. That's the right way to do it. If you want to give parties a joint tenancy with right of survivorship, you need to mention both that they are joint tenants and that they have a right of survivorship. Here's an example to show how conveyances by tenants in common work. Let's assume that A and B are tenants in common in this parcel of land, and we'll call it Blackacre. And let's suppose that A deeds to X, quote, the north half of Blackacre. What is the result? What do the parties own after that conveyance? Well, the answer seems confusing at first, but if you think about it carefully, it's so clear as to be absolutely obvious. The answer is that A has subdivided A's interest and given his interest in the north half to a new party. So in the north half of Blackacre, now the new owner, X, is a co-tenant, a tenant in common with B, and X and B each own 50% as tenants in common in the north half. However, in the south half, nothing has changed because A's deed didn't cover the south half of Blackacre. So in the south half, A and B are still co-tenants, and each of them still owns 50% as tenants in common in the south half of Blackacre. Sometimes a co-tenant will try to take exclusive possession of part or all of the land that's held in cotenancy. Let's suppose that A and B are tenants in common in Blackacre, and A says to B, I'm going to take exclusive possession of the north half of this land and you stay off of it. Well, there's nothing to stop A from making the statement, but the statement has no legal effect at all, and B is still entitled to possess the north half as well as the south half along with A. In other words, each party is entitled to possess all of the land all of the time, and neither can unilaterally keep the other off any part of the land. Now, if the two parties mutually agree, for example, that A will possess the north half and B will possess the south half, that's perfectly fine, and it's perfectly enforceable as long as it is a mutual agreement. But A cannot unilaterally keep B off any portion of the land. The same principle applies if there's a valuable resource on the land and one of the co-tenants tries to grab it for himself. Again, let's suppose we have Blackacre here with some valuable timber growing on it this time, and let's suppose that A grants to X the right to cut one half of the timber on Blackacre. Now that seems plausible. We might say, well, A is a half owner, and therefore the right to cut half the timber belongs to A. However, the truth is that the law considers every tree and every limb and every twig on every tree to belong equally to A and to B. And that means that if A gives X the right to cut some timber on Blackacre, every tree that gets cut down belongs half to B as well as half to A. And so, if there are royalties from the timber cutting or other revenues, then A is required to share those equally with B, and B is entitled to half the revenue. This would be true of timber, of an oil well, of a mine, of any natural resource on the property. It's considered to be owned equally by A and B, down to the finest amount you can imagine. Every square inch of land, every twig on every tree, every lump of coal if there's a coal mine, everything belongs half to A and half to B. Now, there are some special rules that have to be followed in creating a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. So far, we haven't talked about those. We've just assumed that they're satisfied. Now it's time to introduce them. They're called the Four Unities, and they apply only to the creation of a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. You don't have to follow them, except for one, as we'll see in a minute, if you're creating a tenancy in common. So what are these four rules? Well, the first one is the unity of time. It says that all of the interests in a joint tenancy have to be created at the same time. The second is unity of title, and it means that all of the interests in a joint tenancy have to be created by the same document, the same deed, or the same will. The third unity is unity of interest, and that means that in a joint tenancy with right of survivorship, all of the parties have equal shares. They have to have equal shares. They can't be made unequal. The final unity is called unity of possession, and that's a principle that says that all of the parties have equal rights of possession in all parts of the property. And that unity of possession is really an inherent characteristic of both joint tenancies with right of survivorship and tenancies in common. So it really doesn't fit with the other three because it's a universal principle that applies to all cotenancies. But nevertheless, it's always listed as the fourth unity. It really serves a different purpose than the other three unities, however, because the first three are designed to be rules that must be followed in order to create a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Let's take a look at some problems that illustrate how the unities rules might be violated in attempting to create a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. In the first example, O deeds to A a 50% interest as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. A week later, O deeds to B the other 50% interest as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. Well, the problem here is that A and B did not get their interests at the same time or through the same document, and therefore the unity of time and the unity of title are not satisfied in this conveyance. The result is that A and B cannot have a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Even though that's what the grantor intended to give them, what they end up with, of course, is a tenancy in common instead, because tenancies in common don't require unity of time or unity of title. Here's another example. O deeds to A and B as joint tenants with right of survivorship, with A to have 75% interest and B to have 25% interest. Well, the answer here is that they can't be joint tenants because they don't have equal shares. The unity of interest principle requires equal shares. What that means is if you have two joint tenants, they have to have 50% interest each. If you have three joint tenants, they have to have 33 1/3% interest each. If you have four joint tenants, they have to have 25% interest each, and so on. There's no limit to the number of joint tenants you can have, but their interests always have to be equal. A final example. A, not O, but A now deeds to himself and B as joint tenants with right of survivorship. People often do this, by the way, when they get married. If they already own real estate, they'll decide to put it in joint tenancy with their new spouse. The problem, however, is that A previously had an interest. Now B is receiving a new interest, and the result is that A and B didn't get their interests at the same time or through the same instrument, so the unity of time and the unity of title are not satisfied. The result is they get a tenancy in common instead. Now that's the common law result. In a number of states, the legislatures have passed statutes which change that and which allow one person to convey to himself or herself and another person as joint tenants with right of survivorship. But in the absence of a statute that corrects this problem, A and B will end up with a tenancy in common. Now these are illustrations of the unities problems, and they apply not only to the creation of an original joint tenancy with right of survivorship, but they have to continue to be satisfied as long as the joint tenancy with right of survivorship exists. If they're broken later, that will be what we call a severance of the joint tenancy with right of survivorship, and that's the subject of our next video. Let's take another look at the example at the bottom of the previous slide where A conveys to himself and B as joint tenants with right of survivorship. As we saw on the previous slide, the result of this is that A and B get a tenancy in common because we haven't satisfied the rules of unity of time and unity of title. So is there a different way of doing this that will give us the joint tenancy that we need? Well, if we're not in a state that has a statute that authorizes us to do that, we can use a straw man instead. Who's a straw man? Well, it's just somebody who's around the office. It could be a secretary. It could be somebody who works for us in some other capacity. But the point is that they're willing to cooperate in creating the conveyance that we need. So here's the way we do it. We have A deed to the straw man, and then the straw man immediately deeds back to A and B as joint tenants with right of survivorship. Now A and B are getting their interests at the same time and through the same instrument, and the result is therefore that they do get the joint tenancy with right of survivorship, which is what we wanted. That completes our introduction to cotenancies. In the next video, we'll talk about severance of joint tenancies with right of survivorship. If you have questions or comments, email profdale01@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.